What's going on, guys? It's Zach here, bringing you guys another fantasy football video. And this time I'm going to go over the robust running back draft strategy, which will be a draft strategy that emphasizes taking running backs early on in your drafts and then following that up by building out your other positions later on. This certainly gives you an edge over your opponents during the course of the season, at least at the running back position, where especially this season we see teams taking wide receivers earlier and earlier, and it's certainly presenting an opportunity for there to be some drafts or taking running backs early on is a nice way to zag while everyone else is zigging. This will be my first video in terms of going over draft strategies. I'll go over other draft strategies like hero RB, zero RB, taking early quarterbacks, taking early tight ends, and then I'll also get into some general draft tips, what you can do in redraft, what you can do in snake drafts and auction drafts and all that. So, but you're really trying to dive in on draft strategy as well, and just going to cover more than just player analysis as well, so we can branch out and really just make sure that we know how to dominate our drafts this season. So stay tuned for those videos. This will be the first one here, and I recommend you go watch all those other ones when they come out as well. So if you want to get those ones, please do take a minute to subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. We're at like 345 subscribers right now. Really trying to get that number up to 1,000 by the end of this football season. I know it's going to be wild if we can do that. Let's see if we can. If you like the video at the end of it, please take the time to give it a like. It really helps with the algorithm, really helps grow the channel. So yeah, with that, thank you very much, and let's get into the player or the video. So as a general overview for the robust RB draft strategy, just for those of you who don't know, it generally involves taking 2 running backs in the first 2 rounds or 3 running backs in the first 5 rounds of your draft. It gives you the flexibility to target wide receivers and other positions later in drafts where you might be more likely to find upside. I think in general we know which running backs are going to be good. Injury aside, you can certainly find players in the later rounds that might be handcuffs that outperform, maybe some flex guys that have some fluky seasons and actually perform a lot higher. But generally I think you do see these later round quarterbacks, tight ends, wide receivers being the guys that really break out, especially over the second half of the season, and guys that don't necessarily need injuries to really skyrocket their value over the course of the season. So it certainly does give you that extra added upside without needing an injury to happen. On top of that, it's quite the contrarian strategy this season. We've seen more and more receivers getting pushed up draft boards. Generally, you'll see up to 8 or 9 running backs go in the top 12, and right now you're seeing about 3 or 4 of the draft is pretty much 7 receivers, Travis Kelce, then you'll see Eckler, McCaffrey, and Bijan go in the first round, and that's really about it. So it's been very, very wide receiver heavy this season. I think it's certainly going to present plenty of drafts this year where there will be opportunities for you to go running back heavy just because the value is not going to be there at the wide receiver position. So there will be a time for this strategy. I obviously want to emphasize that you should never go into a draft with a strategy in mind that you're going to force to happen. That's just going to end up resulting in a team that's not going to be optimal. You're going to be taking a position that you shouldn't be taking just because you want to instead of taking the best value. So make sure you have that in mind. Be fluid during your draft. Don't just go into it looking to build out a robust running backs draft strategy or building out a zero RB build, but you should know what each of them are and understand the benefits and negatives of them so that you know how to adapt when you see that that's the form your roster's taking. So yeah. So when do I think you should take this approach? Like I said earlier, like with all draft strategies, do not go into your draft with this as your set plan. You don't want to just demand that you're going to take running backs in the first 2 rounds because maybe you have the 3rd pick and the first 2 picks are Christian McCaffrey and Austin Eckler, and then it would be silly if you to take Bijan when you could just take Justin Jefferson, who's the consensus number 1. So you don't want to go into your draft depending on doing this, but what you should do is you should do this when the best 2 players available for you are running backs at your pick. You also want to preferably do this in a league where you can only start 2 wide receivers and then obviously a flex. That's generally standard. You'll see a standard roster, it seems like these years, is quarterback, 2 running backs, 2 wide receivers, tight end, flex. There are some leagues which are becoming more and more popular where you can play 3, maybe even 4 wide receivers. And in those leagues, you probably want to be emphasizing wide receiver just a little bit more. It makes it very difficult to compete with teams in your league when you only have 2 good wide receivers and you can start up to 4 because in general, especially once you get outside of the top 20 at the position, wide receivers score a lot more, so the flex plays are generally better suited to be wide receivers. And if you're going to be thin at wide receiver, you don't want to be thin at wide receiver in a league that you can play several of them. It's also obviously best in non-PPR or half PPR leagues and full PPR leagues, receiving backs who are you can generally do better off getting scat backs, and you can do okay with them as 3rd down backs and sort of play them in the flex, make them work okay for you as your RB2. And it also just elevates the value of tight ends and wide receivers. So being running back heavy just isn't as valuable with leagues like that. So now I'll just go over a couple of examples. I did a couple of quick mock drafts. I just did 7 rounds of what it would look like if you took these approaches. I did a mock draft at pick 3 for here, and I ended up getting Austin Eckler, Derrick Henry in the first 2 rounds, which I think is a perfectly acceptable start. I was a little upset. It did go Justin Jefferson, Christian McCaffrey with the first 2 picks. So, like I said, in my personal opinion, I would have taken Jamar Chase at pick 3 here, but because I was trying to build a robust RB build, I did this, and obviously ended up being suboptimal because I didn't get the player I wanted. I also find that in general, taking this approach with an early 3rd-round pick, all of the good wide receivers are gone, along with pretty much the running backs that I'm in love with. So I find myself, if I have an early to mid 3rd-round pick, I find myself leaning towards taking Mark Andrews or one of those 3 quarterbacks if they're available. So that's what I did here. And then obviously I feel, having only taken 2 running backs and a tight end, I have no wide receivers at this point, so I took 4 straight wide receivers. I went Keenan Allen, Jerry Jeudy, Tyler Lockett, and Mike Evans. I think that in general, that's actually a pretty solid wide receiver core. Those are 4 guys that I'm pretty confident in performing throughout the course of the season. I feel like I've got a pretty good shot of having 2 top 5 running backs there, so I do like how this team turned out, even though it didn't necessarily go optimally. I will touch on some pros and cons of how this goes later on, but what you can see is having to take 4 wide receivers in a row. I feel like that does generally limit the upside of your teams a little bit, because say there had been a value at a running back position, the guys I love a lot, like David Montgomery, James Conner, and stuff that you can get in the 5th, 6th, even 7th rounds. And if a value presents itself for one of those players, you really just can't capitalize on it because you're pigeonholed into taking a position. So this is a certainly acceptable team, but I just want to make it known that I don't necessarily love it because I went into this draft trying to build a robust RB build, so it didn't necessarily go perfectly. Next up, we've got another example. I picked at pick 6 here. It went very similarly. I went Bijan, Tony Pollard to start my draft. I think that's a pretty significantly weaker start to my draft than going Austin Eckler, Derrick Henry, but not too bad. I still like those top 2 running backs quite a bit. I've got them both ranked inside my top 8. And then again, I've got that mid-3rd round pick. I don't love any of the wide receivers really in that range, so I found myself taking Josh Allen. And then again, I had to go 4 straight wide receivers, going Keenan Allen, Chris Godwin, Mike Williams, and Treylon Burks. Next up, I did a draft at pick 9. All of these drafts, by the way, were done in a 12-team half PPR league with a roster size of 1 quarterback, 2 running backs, 2 wide receivers, and a tight end. So again, I want to emphasize that, and a flex as well. But again, I want to emphasize that there were only 2 starting wide receiver slots in this, so it makes a robust running back draft strategy more viable. But in this one, I really felt like the running backs available to me just weren't good enough to justify taking a second running back over Stephon Diggs in that 2nd round. So I went Saquon Barkley, Stephon Diggs, and then felt that because I'm targeting that robust RB build, I had to get 2 running backs in the next 3 rounds. So I went Aaron Jones, J.K. Dobbins, then I rounded it out with Jerry Jeudy, Justin Herbert, Marquise Brown. Again, I really like this build. Got 3 good running backs that I like quite a bit, 3 receivers that I'm pretty happy with, and I've got a really good quarterback. So a good start as well, but again, it's just an example of how I felt like I needed to be fluid. I was going to be taking a player that was just too far down my board compared to what Stephon Diggs was if I wanted to take 2 running backs in the first 2 rounds. And lastly here, I did a mock draft at pick 12. I ended up starting with Nick Chubb, Josh Jacobs, and then I followed that up with Devonta Smith, Keenan Allen, Justin Herbert, Jerry Jeudy, and Jordan Addison. So a lot of these builds ended up being very similar. Again, I like my running back duo quite a bit. I've got 2 guys that are probably going to be top 10. Then I've got 4 overall decent wide receivers, and I've got a good quarterback there. So, yeah. So just to review, I think there is a time and a place for this draft strategy this season, especially with how frequently we're seeing wide receivers going off the board extremely high. The value is going to need to come to you here, though, so I want to reiterate again, you should never take a position just because you feel like you need to. After taking running backs in rounds 1 and 2, first off, if you force yourself to do that, which I think a lot of people have done for years because they know how scarce the running back position is, we found that people are getting smarter and smarter, and that's why we're seeing more of an even distribution of wide receivers and running backs going in the first couple of rounds, because it just makes sense to take the best player on the board and not force your way into drafting a running back. And as well, if you take those 2 running backs in the first 2 rounds, it really does limit your options going forward in the draft. You're going to feel like you have to take wide receivers, tight ends, and quarterbacks only the rest of the draft, and it just limits your opportunity to get value elsewhere. If you see a run on wide receivers happen and maybe a value presents itself, maybe the 4th round, there's a really good running back value there, you're going to feel really bad about having to pass that up because you just can't justify taking 3 running backs in the first 4 rounds. It's going to be really hard to build out a solid roster there. So I generally feel like taking this approach, I don't love taking 2 running backs in those first 2 rounds just because I think it forces me to wait on at least 1 quarterback or tight end position. As you can see in all of those drafts, my first 7 picks, I either only had a quarterback or a tight end. I was never able to get both and feel comfortable with my roster. And on top of that, if I take 2 running backs early on, like I touched on earlier, it just limits my options in terms of capturing upside and value as the draft goes on. So you need to make sure that as you do that, you're getting value at those 2 running backs because you're certainly passing up the opportunity at getting value later. On top of that, there's a lot of values the running back position in the middle rounds that I love. Guys like Miles Sanders, James Conner, David Montgomery, plenty of other guys that I've talked about so far this offseason, and that generally just makes me avoid this robust running back approach, even in a year where it would be an opportunity to really be different from a lot of your league mates. A lot of people are starting drafts wide receiver, wide receiver. We've seen quarterbacks moving up the draft boards as well. So running backs are certainly slipping down in the draft boards, but I think because of that, it gives you an opportunity to wait on them just because you can get really good high-end running backs in the third round now, in the fourth round, in the fifth, sixth, seventh round. So obviously there's a time and place for taking these guys really high. Um, but if you're going to take two running backs in the first two rounds or take three in the first five, just make sure you're getting values, make sure you're getting the best guys and guys that you're super confident in because there's a lot of value to be had later on in drafts. And I think it's just a risky game to play taking that many this early. So that'll do it for the robust running back draft strategy video. If you have any questions on this draft strategy, if you want me to clarify anything, feel free to let me know in the comments. I'm happy to offer those suggestions to you as well. If you've got any just which players you should take, any draft questions, let me know. I'm happy to interact with you guys there. If you did like the video, please do take a minute to like it and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. It really helps with the algorithm. We really love help build the channel out and help it grow. Up next, I'll be doing an auction draft tips video, so I'll go over just general tips and tricks in an auction draft. I think that auction drafts are something that are super fun. I've loved doing those throughout the years, and I think it's something that's really underrepresented in the community so far. There's just not a whole lot of content out there, and I think that leaves a lot of people feeling lost when they get into one. So I'll try and put out some tips there. It really helps you guys. You guys seem to like that. So stay tuned for that one, and I'll catch you next time.